Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a collaboration of 75 organizations here in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is a wonderful historian, actually, Mr. South Carolina history, Walter Edgar. He spent 40 years teaching at the University of South Carolina. That does not include the years he was there getting his doctoral degree in history. And after leaving graduate school, he joined the United States Army, where he served as a captain and ultimately retired from the reserves with the rank of colonel. Thank you, Colonel Edgar. I'll let you say a few words in a minute. It takes a while to introduce you because you've written so many great books. I think you were an editor of the papers of Henry Lawrence, and I think the book we most want to talk about is your book, Partisans and Redcoats, The Southern Conflict That Turned the Tide of the American Revolution. So that's a great story. It's a big story that we don't hear enough about, and you put it in such a good, compelling way that it's a riveting tale. So why was the revolution in South Carolina such a violent affair, more so than it seems in another place?
Well, there were a lot of reasons. Part of it had to do with the behavior of the British troops once they were here. Their grand plan, of course, as you remember, Bob, was to roll up the southern colonies and then kind of say, "Okay, we got what we want."
Right. Yeah.
And they captured Charleston. Charleston surrendered in 1780 in May, and then they began to move into what we call the back countries, the upper part of the state, where 2/3 of the white population lived. Scots Irish, German, English, a group that, by the way, initially had not been too hot for the revolution because they had more issues with the folks in Charleston than they did with the King of England.
Right.
That was turned around by the behavior of the British Army of Occupation. If you've seen the movie The Patriot, and I don't recommend it for its history, but by the way, if they had actually included some of the things that were done by Tarleton and others, they couldn't have gotten a rating.
Wow.
They were really vicious occupiers. And of course, they were English, and that they looked down on all colonials, but especially Scots Irish, whom they considered scum.
Yeah.
And so they mistreated people who had basically said, "Okay, the war's over."
Yeah.
And once they started, and I guess the violence, of course, is Tarleton's Quarter at the Battle of the Waxhaws, when a group of Continentals from Maryland was trying to surrender. And they were cut down viciously with cavalry sabers and bayonets. And that helped galvanize the backcountry. And there's a wonderful little poem. It's actually a prayer. It captures how these folks felt. It's called The Prayer of John Miller, a Presbyterian Elder. And this was used in Presbyterian churches in the backcountry, even after the American Revolution. And it goes, "Good Lord our God, who art in heaven, we have reason to thank thee for the many favors at thy hands, the many battles that have been won. There's the one great and glorious battle at King's Mountain, where we killed the great General Ferguson and took his whole army, and the great battle of Ramsar's and Williamson's, and the ever memorable and glorious battle at the Cowpens, where we made the proud General Tarleton run down the road helter-skelter. And good Lord, if you'd not suffered the cruel Tories to burn Billy Hill's ironworks, we would not have asked any more favors at thy hand. Amen."
Amen. Wow.
Amen. That was the thing. They were in it because Billy Hill's ironworks was burned. Isolated homesteads were. Women were. They always say brutalized. They don't necessarily say the rape, but physically beating them, slapping them, that kind of thing.
Terrible thing. And Billy Hill also was from Belfast. He was Scots Irish. So again, you have this war on people the English particularly regarded as subservient, and
yes,
weren't.
and they weren't behaving that way.
Yeah.
And of course, among the most noted of those Scots-Irish scum that got involved in a violent way was Andrew Jackson.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
As a 13-year-old boy.
Hmm. Yeah. He was. Yeah. He was wounded, wasn't he?
Yes. Actually, his wound came from an English officer.
Hmm.
Jackson was 13. His older brother, Andrew, was 17. And they were actually with a partisan group,
Hmm.
operated on the border. And, he wasn't a messenger. He wasn't a drummer boy. He carried a rifle.
Wow. Wow.
He was captured after a raid
Hmm.
and imprisoned at Camden. And an English officer demanded that he shine his boots.
Hmm.
And this scrawny little Scots-Irish, he's never a big guy,
Yeah.
scrawny little Scots-Irishman says, "Sir, I'm a prisoner of war and demand that you treat me as such." Now, the effrontery of this.
Yeah.
So the guy pulled his cavalry saber, took a swipe at Andrew, and Andrew put up his arm, and the saber went to the bone. He carried the scar and his hatred of the English his whole life.
Wow.
The same demand was made of his brother, who applied the same way, but he was not as nimble. He was clipped in the head and died from his wounds about 6 weeks later.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
The war in the backcountry included everybody, men, women, and children. It didn't make any difference, and the violence was on both sides, Bob.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
yeah. It really makes us realize what war really is hell that these guys were in.
Well, it is, and in many ways, it turned out to be a civil war in the backcountry.
Yeah, I know there's a letter from Nathaniel Greene to his wife saying he really she wouldn't believe what he's seeing here. Now, he's been in this war now for 5 years, gets to South Carolina, and it is a completely different war that's going on. It is, as you say, the first American Civil War.
Well, and it is a guerrilla war for people to put it in a 21st century context. In fact, if you follow Francis Marion's career, and of course, for those of us old enough to remember the Swamp Fox on TV.
Sure. Yes.
And Marion and others like him, Marion wasn't the only one. They practiced hit and run tactics against the British. In fact, the folks at the Army War College, the Commanding General Staff College out at Leavenworth, look at Marion and say, well, gosh, Mao Zedong, when he wrote his primer on guerrilla warfare, he could have been sitting behind Francis Marion, because you hit and fight, you don't stand.
Right.
And then you disappear back into the swamps and the population.
Yeah. Can we talk a little? Who was Marion, and who were the men with him?
Okay, Francis Marion had been a soldier in the state militia. He fought in the Cherokee War, and when he was not in Charleston when Charleston fell, he was home. He had hurt his leg, supposedly trying to get away from a drunken brawl as young Army officers did. He swore that. Anyway, he was home, and he rallied when the British began their move into the other parts of the state after Charleston. They burned Presbyterian meeting houses, and so Marion began to rally the locals, and they hid out in the swamps and the forests of the lower part of the state we call the Low Country, and they were mounted. That made movement very, very easy. Today we think of the forests as being so thick, but back then the original growth forests were pretty clear. You could ride, and so he would hit and run. He didn't stand. Hit a supply train. Hit you send out some scouts. Ambush them. So, and he was just one of literally probably a dozen or so who
Wow.
had local bands. The
Right.
best, clearly the best known though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 We're talking with Walter Edgar, historian emeritus still an historian from the University of South Carolina and author of Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern Conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution. And we've been talking a little bit about Francis Marion and then some of these other really extraordinary characters who are engaging in a guerrilla warfare in South Carolina. And how do we remember all of these folks today? How is
Well,
South Carolina remembering them?
well, South Carolina remembers them, and they remember the American Revolution. Now, I must say that in my 40 years of teaching, I kept trying to remind South Carolinians that the Revolution, um, we won that war.
Yeah.
um, the Civil War, the American Civil War, overshadowed everything in
Right.
South Carolina history.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the other well-known guerrilla fighters was Thomas Sumpter.
Right.
Not a particularly good
Mm-hmm.
military general, but an incredible recruiter.
Mm.
And he got into the war just like the Presbyterian elder. The British burned his plantation, roughed up his wife, who was, by the way, a semi-invalid, and so that was why he was in it. But he was not quite as effective as Francis Marion.
Right. Why did the British particularly target Presbyterians?
They were associated with the Scots-Irish, and they were very clannish. Fairly sizable number of them in the backcountry of South Carolina, where the churches were the focal point of the community.
Right. Now, you have a great series of stories about a Captain Christian Huck, who seems one of the most unlikely Quakers I've come across. Can you talk a little bit about Captain Huck?
Yeah. Captain Huck was a member of the British Legion. That's Tarleton's group. He was a Pennsylvanian, and he was sent out as a raiding party to go to a place called Williamson's Plantation. It was on the main road, one of the main backcountry roads, two-lane ruts. And there, he and his men, some of his men, not he personally, roughed up the wife of a patriot. And the word got out, and he set up camp and didn't set out very good pickets. The local boys heard what had happened, and the next morning they attacked Huck, completely destroyed his force. Those who tried to flee into the woods were hunted down and killed. And as the account said, for a month afterward, carcasses could be found in the neighborhood. So there was no mercy shown there. And interestingly, in some of Cornwallis's correspondence, he talks about, this is a very unsettling affair of Captain Huck. Well, yes, it was. It was the first real response to the British after the occupation of Charleston. I mean, they thought it was all over.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the officers had taken their paroles; they had gone back home. But then Sir Henry Clinton, before he left Charleston, rescinded those paroles and said, "You gotta swear allegiance to the king, and if he calls you to arms, you've got to do that." And so that was a very bad mistake, because that made people say, "Okay, you violated the oath.
Right.
We now feel free to take up arms."
Right. Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about Benjamin Lincoln, the commander of the Continental Army in Charleston, and what What's he trying to do, and why does it not work?
All right. Benjamin Lincoln commanded the Continental Forces in South Carolina, supported also by uh, local militia.
Sure.
And he was to defend Charleston. Well, he was operating in a very traditional European kind of warfare. Instead of using the swamps and rivers of the Low Country as defensive positions to stop the British, he said the sensible thing for me to do is to move back into Charleston. There's a wall, a fortress literally across the whole lower peninsula of Charleston, and we'll defend it that way. Well, what he did is he pulled his troops into a bottle, and the British put a stopper in it. And they began a traditional siege, a very traditional siege against Charleston. And there was a question of, he thought about wanting to actually discuss with the local officials of taking his arm, escape with your army. And the local officials said, no, you've got to defend us.
Oh, wow.
And before we went on the air, you and I were talking about he made a comment, and I'm just paraphrasing, he said, I was peppered or fired at as much by the inhabitants as I was by the British cannonade. So other than the fact the governor and a few officials did leave the city before it fell, Lincoln eventually surrendered his force, and it was one of the largest, in fact, in the Revolution, it was the largest American surrender, 6,000 men, and all of whom took their parole and thought they were going to go back home and just tend their farms and what have you. But as I mentioned, Henry Clinton did. Now, as you well know, at Yorktown, George Washington had Lincoln accept the surrender.
Right. Yeah. That was a nice gesture on Washington's part, too.
Well, and Lincoln was not completely forgotten in South Carolina, because when the capital, Columbia, was laid out and it was a new city, the streets that run north-south were named for Revolutionary War heroes, and there still is, a Lincoln Street in Columbia, South Carolina. Newcomers think it's for Abraham Lincoln, but if they rationalize history a little bit, they think it's really not for Abe. So
yeah. Even still, I think it would be a stretch to folks in Columbia to want to name a street for that President Lincoln. Now, Horatio Gates doesn't. He's I don't know. Would you say he is less effective than Lincoln, or it's a different set of circumstances?
You mean Granny Gates?
Granny Gates.
Granny Gates, the supposed hero of Saratoga.
Right.
He was not the man that Washington wanted to come south. He really wanted to send Nathaniel Greene.
Of course, Gates wanted to replace Washington as commander of the overall.
Yes. And of course, the real hero at Saratoga was Benedict Arnold, but that's a segue we don't need to get into.
Yes.
So anyway, Gates is the political choice. Congress forces Washington to choose Gates. He comes south. Contact is made with local folks like Marion and Sumpter. He's very dismissive of Marion because Marion's band is a very interesting group. It includes some Native Americans. It includes some free persons of color. And just the local boys, and they were kind of ragtag. And Marion gave advice of, the way you're coming in from that part of North Carolina, how are you going to feed your men? Well, Thomas Sumpter, who was good at buttering up people, and he has a very good presence. Well, Gates liked him, and so they did. Gates decides to march towards South Carolina. The British are in Camden, and the forced march of his troops, he was pushing them. They don't have adequate food supplies. They're eating green corn and molasses, which is a very good laxative.
Yes.
And the two armies kind of bumped together unintentionally because Gates didn't have good scouts out, and Sumpter wasn't there. So anyway, the two armies bumped together. It's a brutal defeat for the Americans. Excuse me. And during the course of the battle, Gates gets on his horse, changes several times, and doesn't stop galloping until he gets to Charlotte, North Carolina. His troops called him Granny Gates, and among other things. Now, there's some historians, Bob, that are now trying to buff up Gates's history and say, oh, he really wasn't that incompetent. He really wasn't that. But I'm sorry. I buy the old stories.
I think you're right. We're talking with Walter Edgar, author of Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern Conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution. You know, I was telling my class last week about Gates and his heroic ride to Charlotte, and they couldn't believe someone could make it that distance in the time that he did.
Galloper Gates was another
Galloper Gates
that came to him after that particular episode. So he is replaced by Nathaniel Greene, who is a very capable general who understands mobile warfare, which is what the military use now. And that is, yes, he's got the Continentals, but he knows how to use people like Francis Marion.
Right.
And even Sumter's not happy about his rank, but he is very effective. And that's, people say, well, Greene never won a battle in the South, but you know what? He won the war.
Right. And there's his
purpose was to keep his army together.
Right. Yeah.
And inflict as many nicks as he could against the British. And that's where people like Marion and Sumpter and Pickens all come in handy, because they can do that.
Right. And then he does draw Cornwallis after him through North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, there are two battles we ought to talk about before we get there.
Okay.
Because originally, Cornwallis left in charge by Clinton. His plan is to march into North Carolina and Virginia. Yeah. Well, there's a place called Kings Mountain. Cornwallis is in Charlotte. Major Ferguson, who is commanding 1,000 militia forces, he is the one British officer there. He's a Scot, by the way. And he's been moving through the back country, sending threatening letters to people, particularly to the folks over the mountain in eastern Tennessee. By like, if you're real men, you'll sign up for the king and that kind of thing. And by the way, if you don't, I'm going to whoop you. Well, what happened is Ferguson roused all of the folks in the back country. And for some reason, on his march to link up with Cornwallis, which is what he's supposed to do in Charlotte, he stops at Kings Mountain, which is a strange geological formation. I mean, it's not part of any mountain ridge, but it's this high Monadnock is what I think the geologists actually call it. It is stone. It's anyway, and he decides to camp there. Anyway, you have militia from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and those boys from over the mountain surround Kings Mountain, literally surround Kings Mountain, and move up the hill. And these partisans, they're all militia, have rifles. The ones who are armed under Ferguson have muskets. And when they fire downhill, they fire high. A rifle aimed up, that's not gonna be a problem. And in the end, the British force is defeated. The backcountry boys show their contempt for Ferguson. They strip his body, and then they urinate on him.
Oh my God!
Well, that is the one thing conflict I had with my editor, because I used the 18th century word. I said they they pissed on him, and she was not happy with that. And she said, they urinated. I'm sorry, mountain boys didn't urinate. It's a very good 18th century word.
That's right. Yeah.
So anyway, that all of a sudden Cornwallis is forced to withdraw from North Carolina. He spends the winter in Winnsboro, South Carolina, and then Greene does something that no good general is supposed to do. At least that's what we learned at the Commanding General Staff College. If you're outnumbered, you don't split your forces. Well, he did exactly that, and he sent one force, split it, and it's under the command of a distinguished Virginian, and moving through the backcountry while he stays put. And Cornwallis divides his forces, and sends Tarleton scampering after the folks near Cowpens, which is actually, the name is derived where backcountry settlers used to bring their cattle and they would then drive them to Charleston. The first cattle drives in this country didn't happen out of Kansas City. They happened in South Carolina.
Right.
So you've got Daniel Morgan, this impressive Virginian commanding, and he sets a trap for Tarleton. And that is, he lines up the militia on the front, and the plan is they will fire 2 shots and then withdraw.
Because they knew the militia were unreliable soldiers, so
they were unreliable, particularly in the face of a bayonet attack. And so the idea was they would withdraw, and then the British would come in and not only be facing regulars, but then the American cavalry would come in, which is exactly what happened. And Bannister Tarleton, this real, he is defeated and escapes barely being captured. Huge amount of British supplies are burned. And English military historians note this was the only place in the American Revolution where British forces fled the battlefield from an American force. They literally fled. So then Morgan joins up with Nathaniel Greene, and they make it's called the Race to the Dan River in Virginia, where they could cross the river and get resupplied and get more men. And Cornwallis follows, but then he decides to move back, and the hunter then becomes the hunted.
Right. Wow.
And by the time Cornwallis decides to leave the Carolinas and move up to Virginia and Yorktown, he's lost more than 50% of his force. Wow. And some colleague of his asked, this correspondence, was he going back into South Carolina? And he basically said, I've had enough adventures there. Wow. And so, when Cornwallis gets to Yorktown, his army has been beaten up. They haven't been well supplied.
Right. Yeah. And then he gets bottled up in Yorktown the same way Lincoln was bottled up in Charleston.
Yeah, right. Or he surrenders, but the war doesn't end in South Carolina because now Nathaniel Greene, and for almost another year there is bitter fighting in South Carolina.
I'm wondering, Walter, if we can talk a little bit about the institution of slavery in South Carolina and how that impacts the war and how the war is impacted by it.
Well, several things. First of all, South Carolina had a majority Black population, had since 1706, primarily in the lower part of the state. Only about 1/3 of the white population lived there. 2/3 of the white population lived in the backcountry. The enslaved population grew and processed rice and indigo. Indigo was a very important dye stuff for the
Hmm.
new English textile industry.
Yeah.
And so it made South Carolinians very, very wealthy. In fact, there is a book on Alice Hanson Jones who wrote about
Yes.
American wealth in the eve of the Revolution, and the greater Charleston area was the richest in the
Hmm.
United States,
Hmm.
much more so than Boston or
Right.
Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so you had a very, very wealthy elite in the lower part of the state
Hmm.
based upon the labor of enslaved folks.
Hmm.
There was not an issue here by a governor like in Virginia. The governor issued a proclamation that if you're enslaved and you come to
Hmm.
fight for us, you'll get freedom. That was not issued by any royal official here in South Carolina, although a number of enslaved people thought that was going
Hmm.
to happen. And when the war was over, the black population had been diminished by 25%.
Wow.
Many of those, sadly, had been enslaved persons who were carried off by the British somewhere else.
Mm.
But the British had also organized, believe it or not, a uh, battalion-sized black dragoons
Wow. Hmm.
called the Carolina Corps,
Wow.
and it, after the Revolution, moved to the Caribbean, where its main purpose was to capture runaway enslaved persons.
Wow.
And
Fascinating.
the British units all have regimental tunes.
Yeah.
Theirs was Carolina in a Sultry Clime,
Mm. Wow.
a,
Wow.
a poem we don't need to repeat. It was.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so
But then John, yeah, I'm sorry, John Lawrence also advocated arming
oh,
blacks to fight on the Patriot side.
yes, that was very interesting. You have John Lawrence, who is a very skillful young officer on
Mm.
Washington's staff,
Hmm.
um, who advocates the arming of enslaved persons to fight the revolution. Um, and the General Assembly of South Carolina
Yeah.
won't have anything to do with that.
Mm.
And then, of course, Lawrence is killed um, after Yorktown in a
Hmm.
skirmish. The British was still there, and he was
Yeah.
killed in a skirmish. And
Mm.
one of those bright young men that
Hmm.
was a real tragedy for the state for him
Mm. Right.
to die.
Right.
And the irony of all of that was, of course, his father Henry, who was president at one time of the
Mm.
Continental Congress, was the largest slave trader in
Right.
South Carolina history.
Mm. Wow. Wow.
So,
Interesting. Yeah, we're talking to Walter Edgar, historian of South Carolina, author of Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution. Now, earlier on when we were talking, you mentioned the Cherokee fighting on the side of the British, and I'm wondering, there's a place called 96 in South Carolina that has a connection with the Cherokee. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about their role, or Native Americans in South Carolina and their role in all of this.
well, Native Americans, the Cherokee sided with the British, the Catawba sided with the Patriots.
Hmm.
I'm going to use that term, patriot and partisan, because there were South Carolinians on the other side and
Sure. Yeah.
Americans
Yeah.
on the other side
Right.
too.
Yeah.
Um, and I had already mentioned that earlier the Cherokee War in the 1760s.
Yeah.
South Carolina, the upper part of the state today, Pickens, Oconee, and Greenville counties was Indian territory. And when the Revolution broke out, the Cherokee uh, descended on the upper part of the state, present day Spartanburg County,
Hmm.
and that part. And the entire frontier kind of went up in flames. And from
Mm.
Virginia to Georgia, the militia brutally went after the Cherokee towns, the lower towns, which
Hmm.
were in upper South Carolina and part of North Carolina, and
Mm.
pretty much drove them out of the area. Burned crops,
Mm.
burned towns, um, and the Cherokee never were much of a force in terms of the revolution in South Carolina. Um, that was used by the Patriots early on of why you backcountry boys ought to be with us, because
Hmm.
they will unleash the Cherokee
Right.
on your homesteads.
Hmm.
And the Englishman in charge of Indian affairs in the southern colonies was a South Carolinian, John Stewart,
Yeah.
and he was trying to do exactly that.
Hmm.
Um, but that was from his base then in Pensacola, which was British West Florida,
Right.
not
Yeah.
Spain.
Mm.
Uh, so
Yeah.
um,
And why did the Catawba side with the Patriots?
um, that is very interesting. They had, well, the Catawba area had not been uh, overrun too much by white settlers, and there had early on been a fairly amicable relation. The Catawbas were, in some ways, an amalgamation of smaller Indian
Hmm.
tribes or nations in South Carolina, and
Mm.
the remnants came together as the Catawbas,
Mm.
and they maintained independent status. They are a federally recognized tribe in South Carolina now,
Mm.
and the Catawba fought in the Revolution. In fact, the cover of Partisans and Redcoats, you see Native Americans there. That wasn't just put in to be politically correct, as I was accused by a couple of reviewers. I said, you don't know your history.
Mm.
Um, but during the American Civil War, there were
Mm.
several companies of Catawbas who fought with South Carolina in the Confederacy.
Interesting.
Um, so the tribe is still there. They had their headquarters near Rock Hill,
Hmm.
um, and
So unlike the Cherokee and Creek, they're not removed out to Oklahoma.
no, they are not removed. Um, and had it not been from objections of um, some religious groups, their wonderful casino would have been located in South Carolina, but um, couldn't happen. So it's now in North Carolina.
Hope it wasn't the Presbyterians.
No,
Okay.
no.
This is fascinating stuff. We were talking with Walter Edgar, author of Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern Conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution, as well as many other books on the history of South Carolina. It's interesting talking about the Catawba fighting for the Confederacy. So did some Cherokee, in fact. But yeah.
Well, Bob, there's actually an interesting way of how the title of that book came about. I had a very good editor at HarperCollins,
Mm-hmm.
and my initial title, I had a quote um, from, I think it was actually from Sumpter, about this brutal Civil War we've gone through. It was,
Yeah.
kind of very academic,
Yeah.
um, and I was talking to her on a Thursday or a Friday, and she said, I don't know. I'll
Mm.
call you on Monday. Well, she called me on Monday and said, um, my marketing group read your book. And I almost fainted when I heard that,
Mm. Yeah.
marketing
Yeah.
and said, we can't, we got to have a short, snappy title. Can you come up with something? And I said, I called my two daughters, one who was working in advertising. And she said, those fancy folks, keep it simple. And she said, what's it about? I said, partisans. And she said, okay, how about Partisans and Redcoats? They liked that.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to use my quote.
Yeah.
No. So the marketing staff at HarperCollins came up with the subtitle. Every book's got to have a subtitle,
Right.
Bob.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that was courtesy of the marketing folks at HarperCollins.
Well, I have to say it worked. So what was their idea that this turned the tide, or that's your position?
That was what they. I mean, I believe that,
Yeah.
but I said, if those guys read the book and gals read the book and
Got
said
that.
that's what it was, that suits me, because that's really the story.
It really is. It really is. So, we've been talking with Walter Edgar, who is an historian, author of Partisans and Redcoats, the Southern Conflict that turned the tide of the American Revolution, as well as engaged in lots of other activities in South Carolina. How are your camellias doing this year?
It's been an interesting year. It was very warm early on, and
Mm-hmm.
then we had a hard freeze in late
Oh.
January.
Mm.
So
Mm.
mixed
Well,
fruit. I've still got one blooming, but some that should be blooming now but the buds, if a bud's showing color when you have a hard freeze, they're
Mm.
gone. But the
Well,
azaleas are prettier this year than they have been in a long time. Everything needs a little bit of cold weather.
okay. Well,
So,
we're getting quite a bit of cold weather right now, so well, I envy you your camellias, your azaleas, and as well as your many books and other work. So thank you for joining us, Walter. Is there anything else we should say before we?
no, Bob, it's been a pleasure. And um, I would like to say what George Bancroft said about the revolution in South Carolina. Since he's a Bostonian, I think it's only proper, don't you?
I think you're very nice to us Bostonians today. Thank you.
Well, look, I've got children who live outside Boston. So anyway, this is what George Bancroft wrote in his first, that great history of the United States
Yes,
he did.
yes.
South Carolina moved onward to independence through the bitterest afflictions of civil war. Left mainly to her own resources, it was through bloodshed and devastation and the depths of wretchedness that her citizens were to bring her back to her place in the Republic by their own heroic courage and self-devotion, having suffered more and dared more and achieved more than the men of any other state.
Wow.
And that came from Boston, not from Charleston.
Well, I'd say amen to that. Thank you. So thank you so much. We've been talking with Walter Edgar, Professor Emeritus from the University of South Carolina, author of Partisans and Redcoats, The Southern Conflict That Turned the Tide of the American Revolution, as well as many other books. Thank you so much for joining us, Walter. It's been really
Bob, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank our producer, our Jonathan Lane, the executive director of Revolution 250, as well as our many listeners. You know, Walter, we thought we'd have a handful of folks in and around Boston listening in every week. We actually have a very wide audience, and every week I thank folks in different places we know are tuning in. And if you're in one of these places, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. He'll send you one of our Revolution 250 posters telling you about all the events coming up. So this week, I want to thank, well, our friends in Boston, as well as Washington, D.C., Warwick, Rhode Island, Kensington, Maryland, Edinburgh in Scotland, and Goose Creek, South Carolina. Thank you.
Okay.
All places between and beyond. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.